Shalom and welcome back to the Rashi Nosh. I'm Pastor Matt.
And I'm Kara.
We are in a brand new Torah cycle, which means we've rolled the scroll all the way back to Genesis. So we are in Parasha Bereshit today, and we're continuing to look at Rashi's commentary. So thank you for joining us, especially if you were with us all throughout last year. This year, of course, we're continuing on going through Rashi, and hopefully we'll pick up on some things that you haven't learned yet, or maybe remind you of some things that are pertinent to our Torah portion. So thank you for joining us. We start out with Rashi's comment on Genesis 1:1, where he says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So Rashi asks a question. Like any good rabbi, he starts by asking a question. And the question is, why does the Torah, which is a book of laws, not start with a law? Why doesn't the Torah begin with the first law that God gave to humanity? Instead, it starts with a creation narrative, the story that God created the heavens and the earth. Why is this? Well, Rashi says that because God created the heavens and the earth, he can give to whomever he wants because it belongs to him. The earth is his. He created it. And Rashi says that the reason that the Torah starts with the creation story is so that the nations can't say about Israel, well, it's unfair that you took the promised land, the land of Canaan. This way, by establishing that the earth is God's and everything in it, and he can do with it what he pleases, if he chooses to give the promised land to Israel, that's his prerogative. He is allowed to do that because he's the one that owns it. So since he is the one who created the world, he has the right to assign the lands to whomever he chooses. I think this is a nice explanation. I think it's good for us to understand that everything is God's and he can do with it what he chooses. Now, this also makes me think of, sometimes we like to think in terms of tithing or giving charitably to different organizations, including this one, including to Ammi. A lot of times we like to look at this in the light of God owning everything, but we are a steward of some of what God owns. So we're in this house, we're in front of this fireplace, but we don't really own it. It belongs to God, and he lets us use it for a while. We are stewards of certain things. And I like this explanation because if we look at it like that, then anything that we have as human beings is a blessing. Anything that we have is a privilege that we have it because we know it doesn't really belong to us. We only sort of have stewardship over it for a while. I think for us as parents, nothing is more apparent in this situation than our kids. You know, we raise them, and then at some point we set them free into the world. We're guardians of them for a while, and even though we'll always be their parents, at some point they become adults and they make their own decisions. So,
I don't like that. No.
Would you like to make decisions for our children?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. So maybe we'll find out a way that we can make decisions for our children. No, I think if we're being honest with ourselves, although I think we could save our children some heartache if we can make decisions for them, sometimes they have to learn on their own. Genesis 1:27, and God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Now, this is something that's really interesting because Rashi says, male and female, he created them. He doesn't say that God created Adam and then God created Eve. Remember, Eve was taken out of Adam. And the word there that's used, by the way, is not rib. It's taken from his side. And what's interesting is when it says that God created them male and female, Rashi takes this to mean that the first human initially had both the male and female components within itself. That Adam, the first man, had both the masculine and the feminine traits within him. And that when God created Eve, he separated that from Adam, now making two halves of one whole. In fact, there's one famous Jewish commentary that says, what if Adam was male from the front, but in the back of him, there was another face facing the other way, and that was Eve. It's an interesting theory that God took something, he split Adam in half, as it were, now having two halves, And then he just had to create a back for each of them.
Very literally.
It's very, yeah, that's something that taken very literally here. Now, when God separates Adam and Eve into two distinct beings, I think it's interesting that if we're created in the image of God, it means that man and woman, both male and the female, are created in the image of God. So that means none of us can rule over the other. We each are created in the image of God. But the other thing I think we have to remember is those things that are typically a masculine role, for instance, in a marriage, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in the marriage, the masculine role is more of the disciplinarian, more of the rule person, that the feminine role of the mother tends to stereotypically be a more nurturing model, a more comforting model, something like that. A caretaker, exactly. So if that is the case, if we're both made in the image of God, then God must have both of those sets of attributes together. And in more esoteric forms of Judaism, this is seen on a diagram which is known as the tree of life, where one side is masculine and one side is feminine. And it's interesting. All my life, my dad, as a pastor, would talk about how in Christianity, the Holy Spirit is looked at as having feminine qualities, very comforting, guiding, nurturing, that type of thing. And where we talk about God, when we look at God the Father, as it were, that he seems to be the lawgiver, the disciplinarian, the judge, the avenger, that type of thing. So if we're both made in the image of God, then all of those qualities, which we see as masculine and feminine, must be present in God himself because we're made in his image. Does that make sense? So even though that seems, so I'm not saying that God is male and I'm not saying that God is female, but we are saying the more masculine things that are associated in humans as male and the more feminine things that are associated with being female, both are at work in God and his divine nature. So although God doesn't have a gender, we call him because he is looked at as a father. He's looked at as a shepherd. He's looked at as these types of things. So even though we use masculine language for God, he is not male. God doesn't have a gender. And I find that very interesting. Number 3, and finally, Cain and Abel. So it says here in Genesis 4, verse 8, and Cain said to Abel his brother, and it says, and it came to pass, they were in the field, and Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Now, something that's interesting, it seems in both of their offerings, each of them brought an offering to God, and one was accepted and one was not. And it's a misunderstanding and an oversimplification to say, well, one made an animal offering and so that was accepted, and one made an offering of produce and that was not accepted. I think it's deeper than that. Judaism teaches us that it has to do with the intent of the heart, with the kavanah in giving an offering. Remember, even in the book of Isaiah at the beginning, it says that God didn't want their sacrifices anymore because they weren't a sweet-smelling offering anymore, that it was something that was detestable to him. Why? Because it had turned into an empty ritual. And so we don't want that. We don't want empty ritual. But there must have been something that is not written down in the Bible, and this is why we believe in an oral interpretation of Scripture. There is something that must have been known in the communication between God and Adam, for instance, that certain offerings were correct. It is interesting that Noah takes with him on the ark, and we'll be in Parashat Noach next week, he takes with him on the ark certain clean animals. This is before the Torah is given. So there must be an idea of certain animals being clean and certain ones not being clean. So there had to be some communication between God and humanity as to what was right and what was wrong, even before a law was written down. Now, Rashi addresses this seemingly incomplete phrase, and Cain said to Abel. According to Rashi, the Torah leaves out the specifics of their conversation. It just says that Cain said to Abel. It doesn't say what he said. Now, the Midrash fills in the gaps for us by suggesting that they argued over various matters, probably territory or their relationship with God, who would inherit the world, that type of thing. Rashi emphasizes that Cain's jealousy ultimately drove him to kill Abel, illustrating the destructive power of envy. And also there are some sages that say that it is possible that Cain didn't realize that Abel would be dead for good, that he wouldn't be able to get back up, that there wasn't an understanding that once you lose your blood, that you're done. That's an interesting perspective. I think sometimes when we get into an argument or a fight, a disagreement with someone, sometimes we have unintended consequences, and sometimes hurts are brought that weren't necessarily intended, that in the heat of the moment we can get out of control. And I think that needs to be pointed out as well. Now, one more thing just for fun that I'll bring up. I know this is the Rashi Nosh, but in our Pearls of the Torah this week, we talked about a different commentary known as the Or HaChaim. And it says there that your brother's blood cries out from me from the ground, or cries out to me from the ground. The word for blood in Hebrew is dam. So you would think it would say that his dam, your brother's dam, blood, cries out from the ground. But it doesn't say dam. It says damim, which is plural. Now what's interesting is, in English, that doesn't make any sense. We wouldn't say that someone, they got cut and they lost their bloods. We don't make it plural. And in Hebrew, that is true as well. The word is dam, but it's used in the plural, damim, which doesn't make sense in English. But the reason it's done that way is the Or HaChaim tells us he not only murdered his brother, but in a sense, he also murdered any descendant that his brother would have. Because now he has no chance to have descendants. Yeah. And so just murdering one person affects generations. And that, I think, is... It's interesting when we look at that in a psychological way. We might not be killing people or whatever, but sometimes even the way we treat people or the words that we use with people, sometimes that can carry down. Yeah. You know, often we talk, and we've talked even in this lesson today about being parents. It's interesting. It seems that we as parents, and any people who are parents, we either decide that we're going to do things the way that our parents did them, or we're going to purposely do things in the way that our parents did not do them. And those, sometimes there are wounds that can be passed down. Sometimes there's trauma, or there is incorrect behavior that causes pain that can be passed down from generation to generation. And the Bible talks about generational curses, generational sin. And this is something that I think we need to look at, and to make sure that if we are treating people in a certain way, without us knowing it, those people could then take that treatment and treat others in the same way that we are treating them. Mm. And that especially can go down through the generations. So we have to be very careful about that. So Rashi on Torah portion, Parashat Bereshit. I hope that this is an exciting time for you as we are going back through the Torah. We're turning over a new page. We're starting a new year. And I hope that this will continue to be a blessing for you. Please share this and subscribe to this channel so that you can get all of the content that we put out. And please share it on your social media so that many, many people can be blessed by this teaching. Thank you for joining us in our home, and we're so glad to be with you. Once again, we say to you, Shalom.